welcome to American Catholic History. If you like our podcast, be sure to rate us and give us a review wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Today we're talking about Mary Lou Williams, who is known as the First Lady of Jazz. She was a woman with tremendous strength, talent, and grace who always seemed to be a blessing to everyone around her, despite being treated very poorly by many people throughout much of her life.
Now, we've talked about a lot of people who chose lives of hardship and sacrifice, like the priests and religious who came over from Europe, fleeing the French Revolution, or those who came to be missionaries. Those people have remarkable stories because of the example they give of choosing sacrifice for others over their own comfort. Mary Lou Williams is one of those who had no choice, really, about whether or not she would face hardship and exploitation. But the choice she had was how she would react to these realities.
Yes, and she saw how so many of her dear friends handled difficulty, resorting to drugs and alcohol, some of them dying from these addictions. When her moment of crisis came, she chose a very different path.
Hers is a beautiful story. There's a bit of an Augustinian flair to it. Late have I loved thee, beauty ever ancient, ever new.
Right, she recognized beauty from an early age, but didn't fully appreciate the power of beauty until later in life. So, let's get into this beautiful story.
Absolutely. Mary Lou Williams was born Mary Elfreda Scruggs in Atlanta, Georgia in 1910. Her parents were Baptists and she grew up in their church. When she was still very young, the family moved to the East Liberty neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They had to deal with terrible racism in their neighborhood, with neighbors actually throwing rocks and bricks through their windows from time to time. Mary learned to play piano at 3 years old, and somehow she began giving private concerts when she was still about 5 or 6 in her white neighbors' houses. This made them stop throwing bricks through her home's windows. Her mother actually had no idea she was doing this.
Right. It seems crazy that her mother wouldn't know she was off playing piano in neighbors' homes, but Mary was the second of 11 children. So her mother was probably just happy she wasn't underfoot or causing some trouble.
Yeah, really. And the way her mother found out that she'd been doing these concerts was because one time Mary broke her arm, and so she wasn't able to go on her regular concert circuit. Some of the neighbors actually came by asking where the little piano girl was, and that nickname stuck with her.
So from an early age, Mary learned that playing piano was a way to bridge gaps and share an experience with others.
By the time she was 12, she'd already mastered most kinds of popular music around the time. Ragtime, parlor, piano favorites, light opera, boogie-woogie, stride, waltzes, and marches. She was a regular in local venues, including the Orpheum Circuit, the precursor to RKO, to make money to help support her 10 siblings.
By 13, she'd begun touring with a band and even played with Duke Ellington and his band, the Washingtonians. Traveling became a thing. When she was in her late teens, she was playing in Harlem in New York City when Louis Armstrong walked in, stopped to listen to her for a while, and when she was done, he picked her up and gave her a big kiss.
Quite an endorsement. Yeah. Now, one important thing to note here, Mary Lou didn't learn to read or to write music until she was 20. Everything up to this point was by ear and just understanding a keyboard and chord structures. And to me, that's just remarkable. She could hear something and quickly pluck it out and variations of it on a keyboard just by ear.
But when she was 20, she got a job as an arranger and a pianist for a swing band, Andy Kirk and his Clouds of Joy. This meant she couldn't just play what she knew how to play. She had to write out what others should play as well.
Yes, it's important for band members to, be on the same page.
Yeah. So she wrote the pages.
Yes. Well, she really got on the same page, so to speak, with one of the band members. In 1927, she married the saxophonist, John Williams. Since she had taken the name Mary Lou as a performer, after the marriage, she became Mary Lou Williams.
The late 1920s saw lots of travel and great successes as an arranger and in composing some of her own original pieces for the Clouds of Joy. But before we move on in the next event in Mary Lou's life, let's take a moment to get further into what an arranger does, because it'll play a large role in her life as we talk about it going forward.
Yeah, so the arranger for a band takes whatever tune they're working with and writes out which instruments will play which part. So, which instrument will have the melody and which instruments will be playing which parts of the harmony and the rhythm, what the drums will be doing, etc. The arranger will work with their knowledge of the combination of instruments within their own band, and even with the abilities of the various musicians. In the end, the song is still recognizably what it is, but it's gotten a new interpretation and sort of a new flavor based on what the arranger did with it.
So, when a song is done by a different artist or band, especially if they play in a different style or if they just have a different, some different instruments from the original artists, a new arrangement has to be written.
Right. For those familiar with Scott Bradley's postmodern jukebox, this is exactly what we're talking about. Someone, presumably Scott Bradley, writes a new arrangement of a known tune in the style he's going for.
So that's what Mary Lou was doing, and her arrangements became so well known and so respected that she was given gigs doing arrangements for much bigger names, including Betty Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, Earl Hines, and Dizzy Gillespie. In fact, Benny Goodman liked her work so much that he wanted her to sign an exclusive contract. Mary Lou wasn't interested in an exclusive contract, preferring to continue to work freelance. He asked her many times, and every time the answer was no.
Yeah, she liked her freedom.
Yeah.
The 1930s and 1940s saw Mary Lou's star rise, so good move. She became a friend and professional mentor to other big names in the emerging forms of jazz, swing, and the newest musical style, bebop, or just bop. Those names included trumpet player Miles Davis, saxophonist Charlie Parker, pianist Thelonious Monk, and others. They sought her advice and took cues on composition, technique, and how to play with soul from Mary Lou Williams. Many of their innovations in chord structure and chord progression and how to use rhythm and how to blend it all were based on things they learned from Mary Lou. She really was at the center of things, right in the middle of the major developments of 20th century American music from the 20s into the 50s.
But note something about all the names we've mentioned. Benny Goodman, Dizzy Gillespie, Earl Hines, Tommy Dorsey, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, and Thelonious Monk. They're all men.
Yes, they're all men. Mary Lou was one of very few women making a name for herself during this era, and she was certainly the most successful. Her accomplishments and involvement would have been impressive even if she were just another man in the world of jazz. But to do it in spite of being a woman in a male-dominated field, and being a black woman in that time, well, that's just impressive.
Right, but she did suffer due to being a black woman. She was not respected by many. She was frequently denied payment and robbed of recognition. And when other composers and performers would take her arrangements or songs, well, sometimes they'd claim them as her own. She was just treated horribly by so many in the industry.
Compounding this was the devastation of humanity that she saw around her. So many in the jazz scene went in for the full hedonistic lifestyle. Hard drugs, alcohol, loose living, the whole range of self-destructive behaviors. She saw friends succumb to these addictions, marriages and families broken up, careers destroyed, and even a number of them dying. By the early 1950s, she had divorced her first husband, John Williams, after about a decade of marriage, and had even gotten married a second time, though this one lasted less than a year. She had lived in Pittsburgh and New York, played with Duke Ellington's orchestra, and helped him realize some of his greatest hits. She had done her own radio program in New York and composed and performed a number of suites and other pieces.
But things were not well with her, and she knew it. Jazz was losing its popularity, and all of the human wreckage around her had taken its toll. There also is some evidence that she may have been raped at some point and that she even might have gotten an abortion, though that evidence isn't definite. The point is, she knew suffering and exploitation.
To try to clear her head and get some space, she decided to accept a 2-week gig in London. The show turned out to be a commercial variety show rather than a serious presentation of jazz as she thought it would be, so it caused further depression.
And that dealt another blow.
Yes. See, to Mary Lou Williams, jazz was not just another musical form. She regarded jazz as the quintessential art form. Jazz came out of the Black American experience with all of its background of suffering. Since it came from suffering and expressed that suffering in music, jazz could communicate the experience of those who suffered in beautiful ways that words never could touch.
And it's not that only Black people could appreciate jazz. She believed that all who suffered, regardless of race, could understand jazz and feel its healing power. But that power was only possible because jazz grew out of such a depth of suffering.
And for her, jazz wasn't just for Black people. In 1975, she told the New York Times, "Americans don't realize how important jazz is. It's healing for the soul. It should be played everywhere, in churches, nightclubs, everywhere. We have to use every place we can." To her, jazz was important for all people. It came from the Black American experience of suffering, but what it offered back could be healing for all. Jazz was that important to her.
So, what this gig in London did, taking this thing which meant so much to her and turning it into a commercial variety show, was just one more affront to her soul.
As the 2-week tour was ending, she decided she just couldn't go back to New York anytime soon. So she got more bookings in England and all over the European continent, and she stayed in Europe for 2 more years.
It was while she was there that she first began to pray. The idea to pray came from an American soldier who was still stationed in Europe after World War II. She said of that encounter, "I played in England for 11 months and spent money as fast as I made it, but I was distracted and depressed. At a party, I met this GI. He noticed something was wrong and he said, 'You should read the 91st Psalm.' I went home and I read all of the Psalms. They cooled me and made me feel protected. I just slept and ate and read the Psalms and prayed."
Not a bad plan of life.
Well, no, not at all.
In fact, Psalm 91 in particular, I can imagine that being ready on the lips of a GI in wartime. "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High, who abides in the shadow of the Almighty, will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust," etc. It is a powerful one, especially for somebody facing, threats and hardships.
Yeah, I can see that psalm really grabbing the mind and heart of someone who's just in the depths and reaching for help. Mary Lou's depression came to a head in 1954 when she was playing in Paris. She was doing a show at a well-known cabaret called Le Boeuf sur le Toit when she just walked off the stage. She had determined that everything around her was the problem. The nightlife, the jazz music, the drugs, the loose living, all of the sinfulness around her was all wrong, and she could no longer be a part of it. She wrote, "I was still looking for peace of mind, and I determined to give up music, nightlife, and all else that was sinful in the eyes of God. And after that, I wouldn't play anymore." Now, that's a startling determination for someone for whom music was such a huge part of life.
Seriously. Now, she returned to New York and began to change things immediately. She gave away all of her nice clothes and gave away money to anyone who needed it. She'd never been wealthy despite all of her success, but even what she had, she was just giving away.
She also started taking people into her home, people with serious addictions, including friends from the jazz community. She would take them in and try to nurse them to health and try to help them get and stay sober.
Her big-time music friends tried to help her by offering her big contracts and high-paying opportunities to come back to jazz, but she just turned them all down. The only time she played was when she absolutely had to make enough money to live.
And during this time, her prayer deepened and became more specific. She developed a list of 900 names, people whom she would pray for by name every single day. And this was when she found Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic Church in Harlem. She wasn't Catholic, but the church doors were unlocked, so she was able to go in during the day to pray. Incredible things that can happen when churches keep the doors unlocked.
Indeed. Yeah. After a time, she bought a rosary and prevailed upon a friend whom she knew had been raised Catholic to teach her the prayers for it. Hours were spent in prayer at Our Lady of Lourdes. Eventually, her friend Lorraine Gillespie introduced her to a priest. Lorraine Gillespie was the wife of William's old friend, the band leader and trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie, and Lorraine was considering becoming Catholic. So she introduced Mary Lou to Father John Crowley, who was himself a saxophonist and a fan of jazz.
Father Crowley had 2 pieces of advice for her. First, for her own safety, she should stop taking such risks by taking in so many addicts and trying to reform them on her own. Naturally, it wasn't that he didn't admire what she was trying to do, but there were safer ways to go about it. His second bit of advice was to return to playing the piano. He told her, "Mary, God wants you to return to the piano. You can serve him best there, for that is what you know best.
God had given her a great gift, and she had nurtured her ability. So the way she could serve God best would be through her music.
And what great advice it was.
Absolutely. Mary Lou said that her time at prayer became a time when new melodies and new musical possibilities came to her at a feverish pace. Her mind began taking all of the new sacred themes that had never entered her mind before, and she was combining them with the music that just flowed through her.
Her mind turned thoughts, feelings, and emotions into music, so the intense experiences she had in prayer and the new thoughts and ideas she had from reading scripture and other sacred works provided whole new musical vistas.
Another priest, Father Anthony Woods, befriended Williams. He echoed both of Father Crowley's sentiments and took a more active role in her conversion, becoming her spiritual mentor and teacher. Mary Lou Williams and Lorraine Gillespie were received into the church and were confirmed in 1957.
Her reemergence in the jazz scene happened later that year. Dizzy Gillespie brought her to play with his orchestra at the Newport Jazz Festival. This latter portion of Mary Lou's life was no less prolific than that prior to her conversion, but it was far more joyous. Her music became her prayer. She could still pray for all of those 900 names, but she could do it through music. I am praying through my fingers when I play, she said. I get that good soul sound, and I try to touch people's spirit.
In 1962, she wrote her first original pieces of sacred music. One was a setting of the Anima Christi. She took that lovely prayer, adjusted the lyrics a bit, and set it to a pulsing, compelling jazz line. Now, I'd love to include a clip here, but I don't want YouTube to flag our video for a copyright violation. But hers is a profound interpretation, and I'll make sure to link to it and other works from on our episode page on our website.
The other original piece from 1962 was a choral work in honor of St. Martin de Porres, who was known as the Black Christ of the Andes. It also just drips with longing and love for God. Both of these pieces were released on her 1964 album, Mary Lou Williams, alternatively titled Black Christ of the Andes.
During this time, a priest, Father Peter O'Brien, became her manager. Together, they opened new jazz venues in New York City at a time when jazz was not popular.
She also reconnected with her Pittsburgh roots. Dizzy Gillespie introduced her to Most Reverend John Wright, the Bishop of Pittsburgh. Bishop Wright was a fan, and he let her teach music at Seton High School on Pittsburgh's North Side. While there, she composed her first jazz mass setting and called it, fittingly, the Pittsburgh Mass.
Later in the 1960s, she composed 2 additional jazz mass settings. One was commissioned by the Vatican. She titled it Mass for Peace, but along with choreography done for it in 1971, it is now performed outside of Mass and is called Mary Lou's Mass. This was performed as a standalone performance in St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York in 1975.
Her life's work, besides evangelizing through jazz, became helping people to see the sacred possibilities of jazz. She still played secular concerts, but here's the thing. Truth from any source is from the Holy Spirit. A work of art doesn't have to be explicitly religious in nature to convey God's truth.
Right. God speaks through beauty, including beautiful music. So to be an excellent Catholic recording artist doesn't mean only writing songs that have religious lyrics. It means more to be truly excellent at your art form, whatever medium it may be.
Well, it does remind me of the insight of artist Carl Schmidt, who we talked about in another episode.
Yes, now there was a man with a vision of beauty pointing to God.
But there's another way that her newfound Catholic faith really helped her jazz: suffering. No faith captures and redeems suffering like Catholicism. As we described before, Mary Lou saw that jazz came out of the suffering of the American Black experience. She had experienced some measure of it herself. And now that she was Catholic, she had a faith that helped suffering make sense, that made suffering redemptive. It was the perfect marriage in her mind. Really, she couldn't help but make amazing music at this point.
And she did. She spent the last 20 or so years of her life evangelizing through music. In the 1970s, she released a number of albums. She performed at jazz festivals, at prestigious venues like Carnegie Hall, and appeared on various prominent television and radio programs. In 1978, she performed at the White House for President Jimmy Carter and his guests. That same year, she took part in Benny Goodman's 40th anniversary concert at Carnegie Hall.
She also went around to schools giving lectures and performances about the history and importance of jazz. She had spent so many years at the center of the emergence and development of the music of America. Mary Lou Williams served as artist in residence at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina for the last few years of her life, and she led the Duke Jazz Ensemble.
Just imagine being one of her students. My goodness.
Yeah, no pressure.
Seriously.
All those classes must have been amazing. To just listen to her talk about music and hear her play. I think I would have loved that.
I like dropping names. Oh yeah, Miles and I were going over how he was going to do his next piece.
It would have been amazing. And, well, they did listen to her play until she had to stop when cancer took her life in 1981.
Her funeral was held at St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church in New York City. Dizzy Gillespie, Benny Goodman, and Andy Kirk were in attendance to pay their respects to this giant of jazz. Her body was brought back to Pittsburgh, where she was buried in Calvary Catholic Cemetery.
Which is, incidentally, the same cemetery where my paternal grandparents are buried. We'll have to pay all three of them a visit sometime soon.
Yeah, seriously. It's just a little short drive away.
Yep. Mary Lou's legacy lives on. In 2022, jazz pianist, composer, and educator Deanna Witkowski published a wonderful biography of Williams, Mary Lou Williams, Music for the Soul. We actually recorded a great conversation with Deanna a couple of years ago, and it's available for supporters on our, supporter pages.
Yeah. And just last year, in 2024, the Duke University Wind Ensemble performed for the first time the final composition that Mary Lou Williams wrote before her death. She titled it History. It was not quite completed when she died, but Dr. Anthony M. Kelly, a professor of music at Duke University, completed it and prepared it for performance. I actually wouldn't mind hearing that, so we'll have to look for a recording.
There is no doubt that the musical legacy of the piano girl of East Liberty will live on in the music she prepared for others, and so much of her most important work came after her conversion, when she found her life's mission, using her gift of jazz to evangelize and spread the love of God. This has been American Catholic History. If you enjoy American Catholic History, please become a supporter. We've got great perks for supporters, like original conversations. Get information on how to become a supporter and the perks at americancatholichistory.org/support.
Also on our website, sign up for our newsletter, learn more about Mary Lou Williams, see about our upcoming pilgrimages. We're going to Kentucky and Wisconsin next year, and find other great stories from American Catholic history.
We also love the great reviews our listeners leave. Those and the 5-star ratings help others find us. You can email us feedback, questions, tips for episode topics, or other comments at feedback@americancatholichistory.org. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/American Catholic History, on Instagram at ACH_podcast, and follow us on X at ACH1513. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crowe.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Thank you once again for joining us on American Catholic History, made possible by listeners like you.